is one of the most shocking moments in live television history, where a simple promotional interview turned into a brutal confrontation that left viewers stunned, and one of America's most respected actors walking off, set in disgust. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about how this all went down, because this story is absolutely wild. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Clint Eastwood had arrived to promote his latest directorial effort, a gritty western that many were calling his return to form. The studio buzzed with the usual pre-show energy as makeup artists made final touches and producers scurried around with their clipboards. George Stephanopoulos sat across from the legendary director, his notes carefully arranged on the small table between them. The cameras were rolling, and millions of viewers were tuning in for what they expected to be a pleasant conversation with one of Hollywood's most enduring icons. "Good morning, Clint. Thanks for being with us today." Stephanopoulos began with his practiced television smile. "I have to say, at 94, you're still making movies, still directing, still acting occasionally. What drives you to keep going at this stage of your life?" Eastwood leaned back in his chair, that familiar squint barely visible under the studio lights. His voice carried that unmistakable gravelly tone that had defined countless characters over the decades. "Well, George, I guess I just like telling stories. Always have. When you find something you love doing, age becomes just a number. I wake up every morning thinking about the next shot, the next scene, the next story that needs to be told." "That's truly inspiring," Stephanopoulos replied, though there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't planning to keep things light for much longer. "Your new film, like so many of your westerns, deals with themes of justice and morality. The protagonist faces difficult choices about what's right and wrong. Do you think those themes resonate differently with audiences now than they did when you first started making westerns back in the 60s? Eastwood considered the question for a moment, his hands folded in his lap. "I think good storytelling is timeless, George. People understand right from wrong. They understand when someone needs to stand up for what they believe in, when someone needs to draw a line in the sand. That hasn't changed, and I don't think it ever will. Human nature is human nature." "Interesting perspective," Stephanopoulos said, shuffling his notes slightly. The gesture seemed casual, but seasoned television watchers might have noticed it was the kind of movement that often preceded a shift in questioning. "Speaking of standing up for what you believe in, you've been quite vocal about your political views over the years. You've supported various candidates, spoken at political conventions, made statements that have generated significant discussion." Eastwood's expression didn't change dramatically, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible stiffening of his posture. "I've always believed in participating in the democratic process, yes. I think every American has the right and the responsibility to make their voice heard. But some of your statements have been controversial." Stephanopoulos pressed, his tone becoming more pointed. "The empty chair incident, various comments about political correctness, your positions on certain social issues. Do you ever regret taking such strong political stances, especially when they might alienate portions of your audience who just want to enjoy your movies?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Eastwood's jaw tightened slightly, and when he spoke, there was a new edge to his voice. "George, I say what I think needs to be said. I don't worry too much about whether people agree with me or not. I've been in this business for over 60 years, and I've learned that you can't please everybody. You can't make movies by committee, and you can't live your life trying to avoid offending anyone. But surely you understand that with great influence comes great responsibility." Stephanopoulos continued, clearly not satisfied with Eastwood's response. "When someone of your stature makes political statements, they carry weight. They influence people. Don't you feel any obligation to be more careful with your words?" Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his famous steely gaze now fully focused on his interviewer. "Careful with my words? George, I've been careful with my words my whole life. I've chosen every role, every project, every statement with thought and consideration. But being careful doesn't mean being silent. And it doesn't mean apologizing for having convictions." The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Camera operators glanced at each other uncertainly, and producers in the control room leaned closer to their monitors. This was clearly not going according to the planned script of a friendly promotional interview. Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, The resistance he was getting from Eastwood seemed to embolden him further. He glanced down at his notes again, and when he looked up, there was a new intensity in his eyes that suggested he was about to escalate things significantly. "Let me be more specific, Clint," Stephanopoulos said, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor building a case. "You've made comments over the years that many people have found deeply troubling. Comments about minorities, about women, about social progress in general. You've dismissed movements for equality as political correctness gone wrong. How do you reconcile that with the heroic characters you've played on screen, characters who stand up for justice and protect the innocent?" Eastwood's face hardened visibly. The casual, promotional interview demeanor was completely gone now, replaced by the steely resolve that had made him famous in dozens of westerns. "George, I think you're mischaracterizing what I've said, and frankly, I don't appreciate the implication. I've spent my entire career making movies about people doing the right thing, standing up to bullies, protecting those who can't protect themselves. My personal beliefs are entirely consistent with that. Are they, though?" Stephanopoulos shot back, clearly prepared for this response. "Because when you dismiss legitimate concerns about systemic inequality as mere political correctness, aren't you essentially telling people who face real discrimination that their experiences don't matter? Isn't that exactly the kind of bullying behavior your movie heroes would stand up against?" The question hit like a slap across the face. Eastwood sat in stunned silence for a moment, his jaw working as if he was physically restraining himself from saying something he might regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more controlled, but with an undercurrent of barely contained anger. "Now you listen here, George. I have never, not once in my life, told anyone that their experiences don't matter. I've employed people of all backgrounds in my films. I've told stories about people from every walk of life, and I've tried to treat everyone I work with dignity and respect. But I will not apologize for believing that we've gone too far in the other direction, where people are afraid to speak their minds, afraid to have honest conversations about difficult topics. But speaking your mind often means dismissing other people's pain," Stephanopoulos pressed, leaning forward in his chair. "When you make light of movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, you're not just expressing an opinion, you're minimizing real suffering, real injustice. How is that different from the villains in your own movies who ignore the suffering of others for their own convenience?" Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The comparison to the villains he'd spent decades fighting on screen was clearly a bridge too far. "That's enough, George. You're putting words in my mouth and twisting everything I've ever said to fit some narrative you've constructed. I have never made light of anyone's suffering. Never." "Haven't you, though?" Stephanopoulos continued relentlessly. "When you mock safe spaces, when you dismiss trigger warnings, when you complain about political correctness, aren't you essentially telling people who've been traumatized that they need to just toughen up? Isn't that exactly the kind of callous attitude your movie heroes despise?" "You're damn right I think people need to toughen up," Eastwood snapped, his famous composure finally cracking. "Life is hard, George. Life has always been hard. You face adversity, you deal with it, you move forward. You don't spend your whole life wallowing in victimhood, demanding that everyone else change the world to accommodate your sensitivities. So trauma victims are just wallowing in victimhood?" Stephanopoulos pounced on the statement immediately. "People who've been sexually assaulted, who've faced racial violence, who've been discriminated against, they're just being too sensitive?" Eastwood realized he'd walked into a trap, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "That's not what I said, and you know it. But yes, I think there's a difference between acknowledging that bad things happen and turning every slight, every uncomfortable moment, every difficult conversation into a federal case. There's a difference between seeking justice and seeking to shut down anyone who disagrees with you." "And who gets to decide where that line is?" Stephanopoulos demanded. "You? Other wealthy, powerful men who've never faced discrimination? Don't you see the irony in that? You've built your career playing characters who stand up to exactly that kind of powerful, dismissive attitude." The studio had gone deadly quiet except for the low hum of the cameras and the barely audible murmur of the control room. Everyone present could feel they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment where the carefully constructed facade of morning television politeness had been completely abandoned. Eastwood stared at Stephanopoulos for a long moment, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his face were visibly straining. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the kind of tense standoff that might have preceded a gunfight in one of his westerns. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that experienced observers knew meant a storm was coming. "George, I've been patient with you this morning. I came here to talk about my movie, to share something I'm proud of with your audience. But you've turned this into some kind of political ambush, some kind of character assassination disguised as journalism. And frankly, I'm getting tired of it." Stephanopoulos seemed to sense he had Eastwood on the ropes and pressed his advantage even harder. "Character assassination? I'm simply asking you to account for your own words, your own actions. If that feels like an attack, maybe you should consider why. Maybe the problem isn't with the questions, but with the answers you're being forced to give." "Forced to give?" Eastwood's voice rose for the first time, a hint of the famous Eastwood growl creeping in. "Nobody forces me to do anything, George. Nobody ever has, and nobody ever will. But what you're doing here isn't journalism, it's a hit job. You've taken every statement I've ever made out of context, twisted every position I've ever held, and tried to paint me as some kind of monster." "I haven't taken anything out of context," Stephanopoulos fired back. "I'm quoting you directly. These are your words, your positions. If you don't like how they sound when they're played back to you, maybe you should think about what that says about the positions themselves." Eastwood leaned forward, his famous squint now a full glare. "You want to know what I think, George? I think this whole thing was planned from the beginning. I think you never had any intention of talking about my movie, about my work, about anything I actually came here to discuss. I think you brought me here specifically to try to embarrass me, to try to tear down someone who's had the audacity to think differently than you do." "That's a serious accusation," Stephanopoulos replied. But there was something in his expression that suggested Eastwood wasn't entirely wrong. "Are you saying that asking you to explain your own public statements is somehow unfair?" "I'm saying that twisting those statements, misrepresenting them, and using them as weapons is unfair, yes. But more than that, it's dishonest. It's the kind of dishonesty that's destroying public discourse in this country." Eastwood's voice was getting stronger now, more forceful. "You want to know about bullies, George? This is what bullying looks like in the modern world. You use your platform, your position of power, to try to humiliate people who disagree with you." Stephanopoulos's professional composure was starting to slip as well. "I'm sorry, but I find it rich that someone with your platform, your influence, your wealth and privilege, is claiming to be a victim of bullying. You've had 6 decades to use your voice however you wanted, and now when someone asks you tough questions about how you've used it, suddenly you're the victim?" "I never said I was a victim of anything," Eastwood shot back, his voice now carrying the full force of decades of authority. "But I know dishonest journalism when I see it, and I know a setup when I walk into one. And that's exactly what this is." The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, while camera operators continued to roll, knowing they were capturing something extraordinary. "Let me ask you this, Clint," Stephanopoulos continued, his voice now openly hostile. "Do you think your attitudes, your dismissive comments about social progress, your resistance to change, do you think those attitudes have contributed to the very problems you claim to be concerned about? Do you think your influence has made things worse for the people you claim to want to help?" Eastwood stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with a harsh screech that cut through the tension like a knife. "That's it. I'm done with this circus." "Clint, please sit down," Stephanopoulos said, suddenly realizing that he might have pushed too far. "We still have several minutes left in the segment." "No, George, we don't." Eastwood's voice was ice-cold now, carrying the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "I came here in good faith to talk about my work, to share something meaningful with your audience. But you've made it clear that you have no interest in that. You're more interested in playing gotcha politics than in actual conversation." "I'm interested in accountability," Stephanopoulos protested. "I'm interested in having an honest discussion about the impact of your words and actions." Eastwood began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite his obvious anger. "Honest discussion? George, There's been nothing honest about this conversation from the moment it started. You've had your agenda from the beginning, and nothing I could say would change your mind about anything. So you're just going to walk away? Stephanopoulos challenged. That's your solution to difficult questions? Just leave? Eastwood paused in his mic removal and looked directly at Stephanopoulos, that famous stare boring into him like a laser. George, I've faced difficult questions my whole life. I've faced difficult situations, difficult people, difficult choices. But I don't waste my time with people who aren't interested in honest dialogue. I don't waste my time with people who invite me onto their show under false pretenses just so they can try to tear me down. False pretenses? Stephanopoulos' voice was rising now, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. You're a public figure who's made controversial statements. Asking you about those statements isn't false pretenses. It's journalism. No, George, it's not. Eastwood had completely removed his microphone now and was standing at full height, looking down at the still-seated host. Journalism would be asking fair questions and actually listening to the answers. Journalism would be trying to understand different perspectives, not just trying to score political points. What you've done here today is activism masquerading as journalism, and I won't be part of it. The studio fell completely silent except for the low hum of equipment. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented in morning television history. You know what the real irony is here, George? Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying a tone of profound disappointment. The characters I've played, the stories I've told, they're about people standing up to exactly this kind of behavior. They're about people who refuse to be bullied, who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to back down when they know they're right. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. With that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the Good Morning America set, leaving George Stephanopoulos sitting alone at the interview desk, stunned and speechless. The cameras continued to roll, capturing